Take a moment to picture yourself standing at the helm of a massive ship that simply refuses to turn. You can see the iceberg and you know the course needs to change, but the machinery below deck feels rusted shut by decades of this is how we've always done it. Well, this frustrating paralysis was the reality for Japan's corporate giants during what economists call the lost decades. In the late 1980s, Japan was riding high on a massive asset bubble. Stock prices and real estate values had ballooned to absurd levels. When that bubble burst in the early 1990s, it triggered a banking crisis and deflation that would drag on for nearly 20 years. The legendary efficiency that had made Japan an economic powerhouse in the 1970s and 80s curdled into something else entirely: risk aversion. Zombie companies kept on life support by low interest rates and a stubborn refusal to restructure. Corporate Japan became synonymous with stagnation. In this blink, you'll find the blueprint for cutting that anchor loose, drawn directly from Japan's dramatic corporate comeback. You'll learn the mechanics of the Resolute model, a strategy that allows you to dismantle the silos of the past without destroying your organization's identity. By the end, you will understand how to become an ambidextrous leader, one capable of balancing the safety of tradition with the risks of innovation, the kind of executive who can protect a legacy while aggressively building the future. Let's take a journey back to the corporate world of the 1980s. Japan was the envy of the world. The country's success was driven by Theory Z, a management philosophy built on consensus, lifetime loyalty, and careful planning. American executives traveled to Japan hoping to learn the secret, but the narrative shifted. The bubble burst, ushering in the lost decades where celebrated rigidity became paralysis. The system that built the economy was now suffocating it. To understand how this paralysis broke, we need to look away from the boardroom and toward natural catastrophe. On March 11, 2011, a magnitude 9.0 earthquake struck the Tohoku region. In the chaos that followed, tsunami, nuclear meltdown, the traditional corporate manual became dangerous. This is where Lawson, one of Japan's largest convenience store chains, takes center stage. In the traditional model, authority flows strictly top-down. Headquarters decides and the store manager executes. But when the earth shook, headquarters in Tokyo was miles from reality. Roads were impassable, power was out, and supply chains shattered. The centralized standard that defined Lawson's growth suddenly made functioning impossible. Sadanobu Takamasu, who would later become CEO, watched the crisis unfold. Under old rules, local managers should have waited for instructions, but waiting meant failing the community. So something remarkable happened. Frontline staff stopped looking up for permission and started looking out at their neighbors. When delivery trucks couldn't get through, staff loaded motorcycles to distribute supplies. They dispatched gasoline trucks on their own initiative and delivered free food directly to evacuation centers. Within 6 weeks, nearly 90% of surviving stores reopened. This was an awakening. Takamasu realized the company could no longer grow by imposing rigid will from Tokyo. The front lines, or Gemba, possessed wisdom the boardroom lacked. To survive modern volatility, the organization had to invert. Leadership had to listen. You can see this shift in how Takamasu changed his behavior. He physically moved himself to the Gemba, visiting stores to hunt for ingenuity rather than inspect compliance. When he found a local manager trying something new, he praised them. He posted their ideas on internal bulletin boards, signaling to everyone, innovation is allowed here. This transition from habitual adherence toward resolute agility sits at the heart of the new Japanese model. What worked in an era of stability becomes a liability amid uncertainty. The lesson from Lawson is stark. When the ground shakes, literally or metaphorically, the manual written in a distant office becomes irrelevant. Survival depends on empowering people who can actually see the problem. That was the spark. But realizing the need for change is one thing. Dismantling a culture built on decades of seniority and consensus requires a different kind of architect entirely. Recognizing that the old manual is broken is a good first step, but it raises a harder question. Who writes the new one? For decades, the path to the CEO's office was a straight, predictable line. You joined a company fresh out of university, picked a lane, say the metals division or the food division, and climbed that single ladder for 40 years. By the time you reached the top, usually in your 60s, you were a master of your specific silo, but you likely viewed the world through a very narrow lens. And when it came time to pick your successor, you naturally chose someone who looked and thought exactly like you. This created a leadership echo chamber that prioritized harmony over hard truths. Breaking this cycle requires a leader willing to disrupt their own comfort zone, which brings us to Jun Karube at Toyota Tsusho, a massive trading company. When Karube took the helm, he saw that siloed expertise was becoming a liability. If a manager spent their entire career in metals, they became excellent at selling steel but remained clueless about broader shifts in the global economy. They were specialists in a world that increasingly demanded generalists. His solution baffled the traditionalists. He shattered the silos, forcing managers to rotate out of their comfort zones. People who had spent decades in food got moved to completely different sectors. Divisional heads protested, arguing they couldn't function without secretaries who knew their specific jargon. Karube insisted. He was training his future leaders to see the entire enterprise. But even a well-rounded insider is still an insider. To get true clarity, Karube needed fresh eyes from the outside. He began appointing external directors to the board, not ceremonial figureheads, but active challengers. He brought in people completely outside the trading world, including a former foreign minister and executives from unrelated industries. His thinking was shaped by the aggressive candor he'd observed at General Electric under legendary CEO Jack Welch while working abroad. Karube wanted that friction. He wanted a boardroom where directors actually debated strategy rather than rubber-stamping decisions that had already been made. He instituted a bad news first policy, demanding that setbacks be the first item on the agenda. The lesson from Karube's tenure is that agility doesn't happen by accident. It has to be engineered. You have to break the escalator of seniority that promotes people based on tenure rather than talent. You have to invite people into the room who are willing to tell you that you're wrong. Karube proved you can respect organizational harmony while still injecting the friction needed to keep things alive. And once you have a leadership team that can actually see the future, the next challenge becomes figuring out how to build it without destroying the past. All right, now you've got a leadership team that can actually see what's coming. That's the breakthrough. But it creates a new, rather terrifying problem. What happens when that future threatens the very thing paying your bills today? This is the strategic tightrope of the Resolute era. Traditionally, companies became experts at exploitation, wringing every drop of efficiency from existing products. Safe, predictable, profitable, until the market shifts and your core product becomes obsolete overnight. The question becomes, how do you explore risky new frontiers without capsizing the stable ship you're already sailing? This was the exact dilemma facing Takuya Shimomura when he took over Asahi Glass, now AGC Inc. For decades, they'd been the world's premier glassmaker, but by the 2010s, glass had become a commodity. Cheap competitors were driving margins into the ground. The traditional instinct would have been to double down, cut costs, make glass cheaper and faster. Shimomura saw through that trap. Perfecting a dying business model is just a slower way of dying. So he adopted a strategy of ambidexterity. He would use the steady cash flow from traditional glass to bankroll high-stakes ventures into the unknown. He reframed the company's identity from glass manufacturer to materials science pioneer. That sounds like a subtle marketing shift, but in practice, it was a radical restructuring of the corporate anatomy. Here's where it gets interesting. Shimomura knew that if he simply asked his glass engineers to invent unrelated products, the daily pressure of production quotas would stifle innovation before it started. So he built a protected ecosystem for exploration. He implemented a disciplined framework he called MIT, standing for Market Assessment, Incubation, and Transfer. New ideas like using chemical expertise for electronics or life sciences were incubated in a separate division. Only when these seedlings were strong enough did they get transferred back into main operations. Shimomura personally toured facilities, encouraging employees to stop saying glass and start thinking solutions. He set audacious targets. demanding new strategic businesses generate 40% of group profit. That forced everyone to look beyond legacy operations. The gamble paid off. By leveraging past stability to fund future volatility, AGC successfully expanded into high-margin sectors like mobility and electronics. The lesson here? You don't have to choose between stability and innovation. You can and must do both. But maintaining that delicate balance requires more than a smart strategy. It requires a governance structure with teeth, one capable of ensuring these high-wire acts don't end in disaster. And that's exactly what we'll look at next. So ambidexterity is a bold strategy, but even the boldest CEO needs a reality check. When a company pivots from the safety of the past to the volatility of the future, who makes sure the strategy doesn't go off the rails? For decades in Japan, the answer was effectively nobody. Board meetings were often ceremonial affairs, sometimes described by the term shanshan, a reference to the rhythmic clapping of hands that signals agreement without debate. Directors were typically insiders, friends of the CEO, and their job was to nod, not to challenge. For a resolute company to survive, the boardroom cannot be a place of polite applause. It has to become a place of constructive friction. To see what governance with teeth looks like, consider Recruit Holdings. By the early 2010s, Recruit was already a giant in human resources, but CEO Masumi Minagishi knew that comfort was the enemy of growth. He didn't want a board of friends. He wanted a board of what he called deciding directors, people who would actively stress test his vision. Minagishi did something radical for the time. He invited heavyweights from other industries into his inner circle. The former CFO of Sony, the chairman of Asahi Breweries. These were veterans of global battles who owed nothing to Recruit's internal politics. When Minagishi proposed a massive war chest for overseas acquisitions, nearly $7 billion, these outsiders didn't rubber stamp the check. They scrutinized the strategy, forcing the company to abandon its arrogance. Recruit's traditional habit of imposing Japanese management styles on foreign acquisitions was a recipe for failure. The board pushed for a strategy of autonomy instead, allowing acquired companies to run themselves. That pivotal decision helped Recruit become a global tech powerhouse. The true test of this resolute governance came with the most sensitive decision a board ever makes: choosing the next CEO. In the habitual model, the outgoing CEO handpicks a successor, usually a loyal lieutenant who has waited their turn. But in 2021, Recruit's board looked past the rows of senior managers and fixed their sights on Hisayuki Idekoba. Idekoba was a shock to the system. At 45, he was practically a child by Japanese corporate standards, where the average CEO takes the reins at age 60. But Idekoba had something tenure couldn't buy: results. He had spearheaded the acquisition of Indeed and turned it into a global engine of growth. The board decided that in a digital world, waiting for a leader to age into the role was a luxury they couldn't afford. The lesson from Recruit is clear. Governance is the ultimate safety net for strategy. A board that actively decides, rather than just presides, can make sure talent wins over tenure. By installing meritocracy at the very top, Recruit signaled that the old rules were dead. And if the CEO is chosen based on merit rather than years served, that logic can't stop at the boardroom door. It has to reach every single employee. If the boardroom at Recruit proved that merit could beat seniority at the very top, the final frontier for this transformation lies in the sprawling open-plan offices below. This brings us to the most culturally entrenched pillar of the traditional Japanese workplace: lifetime employment. For generations, joining a major Japanese corporation was like joining a family. You were hired for your potential, not your skills, and once you were in, you were a member for life. This system created incredible loyalty, but it also created a peculiar phenomenon known as the window sitter. Employees who had ceased to be productive but protected by the system were simply given a desk by the window to while away their days until retirement. For a company competing globally, carrying passengers is a luxury it can no longer afford. This reality hit home hard for Hitachi, one of Japan's most iconic industrial titans. With over 300,000 employees worldwide, Hitachi was the archetype of the traditional behemoth. But as it expanded its global footprint, it ran into a massive friction point. In its overseas operations, hiring was transactional and skills-based. You hired a specific engineer for a specific task. Back home in Japan, hiring was still about general membership. A manager in Tokyo meant something completely different from a manager in London. Under pressure to unify this sprawling empire, Hitachi made a decisive break from tradition. It began dismantling the membership model in favor of a job-based system. To a Western ear, this sounds like standard corporate procedure. But in the context of Japanese labor history, it was a revolution. For the first time, the company was defining a specific job with a specific description, specific goals, and a specific price tag, and then looking for the best person to fill it, regardless of age or tenure. This shift fundamentally alters the psychological contract between the employee and the firm. In the old system, your salary was largely a function of how many years you had endured. It was a reward for loyalty. In Hitachi's new model, compensation is tied to the weight of the role and the performance delivered. Hitachi had to create a global grading system, mapping out thousands of positions to ensure that a role in Japan was equivalent to a role in the United States. It stripped away the ambiguity that allowed window sitters to hide. Now, every seat had a purpose, and every occupant had to justify their presence. The transition from membership to mastery is perhaps the most painful part of this story because it removes the safety net that defined the Japanese middle class for decades. But as companies like Hitachi have realized, staying relevant demands this change. By clarifying exactly what each person is supposed to contribute, the company empowers employees to own their careers rather than passively riding the seniority escalator. In this Blink to Resolute Japan by Jusuke J.J, Ikegami, Harbir Singh, and Michael Useem, you've learned that Japan's corporate resurgence is driven by a hybrid model that fuses the social responsibility of the past with the decisive agility required for the future. This transformation begins when leaders stop relying on rigid manuals and start trusting the intuition of the front line, as seen when crisis strikes. It gains momentum when executives break down internal silos, inviting outside perspectives to challenge the status quo and push for strategic ambidexterity. By balancing the exploitation of existing strengths with the exploration of new risks, companies can fund their own evolution without discarding their identity. This story concludes by replacing seniority with meritocracy, ensuring that governance actively guides strategy and every employee is valued for their specific contribution rather than their tenure. Okay, that's it for this Blink. We hope you enjoyed it. If you can, please take the time to leave us a rating. We always appreciate your feedback. See you in the next Blink.